The air shuddered when his hand, large and cold as tombstone marble, rested on hers. The murmur of the hall died, drowned in a dense silence that weighed more than time itself. She felt the heat rise to her face, a scarlet betrayal on her pale skin, while his gaze, an abyss of night and ancient stars, held her at the center of the universe. Every breath was broken glass. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10, and tell us what city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. Ilara's arrival at the Alcaster mansion was like the fall of a solitary leaf on a frozen lake. Silent, unnoticed, but destined to ripple the still surface of things. The coachman left her at the wrought iron gates, whose dark scrolls looked like skeletal claws against the grey autumn sky. The air smelled of damp earth, ancient stone, and a melancholy so deep you could almost touch it, like worn velvet. Ilara clutched the frayed shawl around her shoulders, a futile gesture against a chill that came not from the wind, but from the imposing walls that rose before her. The mansion was not a house. It was a presence, a sleeping giant whose breath was the fog that crept through the valley. An orphan and a distant relative, she had come to serve, one more shadow to inhabit the long corridors where the echo of footsteps seemed to belong to ghosts. No one received her at the main door. A servant in faded livery, his face creased with indifference, showed her to a side entrance, the path reserved for those whose existence was to be felt but not seen. Her room was a cubicle under the roof, with a single Gothic window that framed a patch of sick sky and the bare branches of trees. The sound of the wind was her only companion, a long, sad howl that coiled around the eaves like a wounded animal. That first night she didn't unpack. She remained seated on the edge of the narrow bed, her body stiff, listening to the heart of the house, the creaking wood, the distant sigh of a door, the crushing silence that filled every gap. Her vulnerability was a second skin, an outsider's aura that marked her more than any name. She was the piece that didn't fit, the dissonant note in a symphony of power and tradition. It was the next morning that she saw him for the first time. It wasn't a meeting, but an apparition. Lord Valerius Alcaster, the master of these lands, descended the main staircase like a figure torn from an ancient legend. It wasn't his beauty that stopped one's breath, but the authority that emanated from his stillness. Tall, dressed in a black that absorbed the little light in the room, his presence altered the density of the air. The silence around him was different, deeper, heavy with an immemorial history. He did not look at her. His gaze crossed the hall and was lost somewhere beyond the high windows, but Ilara felt it like a physical pressure, a weight on her shoulders. Her heart, once a frightened bird, suddenly fell silent, as if afraid to betray her presence. She shrank into the shadow of a column, making herself even smaller, even more invisible. But invisibility was an illusion. He knew. Just as the mountain knows of the existence of the smallest stone on its slope, he knew she was there. The days that followed were an embroidery of repetitive tasks and fleeting encounters with disdain. Lady Beatrice, Valerius's sister, was a woman carved from ice whose cold, blue eyes measured her with calculated contempt. Her ladies-in-waiting, a chorus of muffled laughter and venomous whispers, made Ilara their favourite target. The orphan, they would say, the word heavy with a weight that crushed her. The humiliations were subtle, an order given in a tone that reduced her to dust, an accidental bump that made her stumble, the isolation that surrounded her like a wall. Ilara learned to walk close to the walls, to breathe without making a sound, to exist on the periphery of the world. Her strength was not in response, but in silent resistance. She absorbed the cruelty and transformed it into an invisible armor. Her thoughts were a secret garden no one could invade. But there was a place where the air seemed less thin, where she could breathe deeply. It was an old winter garden abandoned at the back of the property. A structure of glass and iron, rusted by time, housed a tangle of plants that had grown wild, fighting for light. Vines covered the walls, ferns exploded from cracked pots, and in the centre an ancient rosebush, nearly dead, still clung to life with stubbornness. That place became her sanctuary. There the silence was not oppressive but complicit. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves was a balm. Elara spent her few moments of free time in that green chaos, cleaning dry leaves, pulling weeds, talking to the plants in whispers she would never dare direct at a human being. It was there that Valerius watched her for the second time. He was outside, standing in the shadow of an old oak tree, a dark silhouette against the pale afternoon light. Elara felt his gaze before she saw him. It was like the sudden change in air temperature, a shiver that ran down her spine. Her first instinct was to flee, but something held her in place. Her fingers dirty with soil stopped on a fern leaf. She didn't raise her face, but all her consciousness was focused on that still figure. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched, with an intensity that seemed to pass through the glass and touch her skin. Elara felt her heart beat erratically, a dull drum in the midst of the quiet. In that moment, the garden ceased to be a refuge and became a stage. She was the only actress under an invisible spotlight. What did he see? A maidservant soiled with dirt? An intruder in his domain? Or something more? The uncertainty was a lump in her throat. When she finally dared to raise her eyes, he was gone. Only the wind swayed the branches of the oak, as if nature itself sighed. But the sensation of his gaze remained, permeating the air, an invisible mark that redefined the boundaries of her small world. From that day on, Elara felt his presence everywhere. She didn't always see him, but she sensed him. He was a shadow at the end of a corridor, the sound of firm footsteps on the floor above, the way a candle flame flickered when he passed through the door. The world of the mansion revolved around him, a dark sun whose gravity kept everything in its orbit of silence and fear. The other maids spoke of him in whispers, mixing fear and fascination. They said he didn't sleep, that he roamed the house at night like a sleepless guardian. They said his power came not just from his name or fortune, but from something older, deeper, something connected to the very earth he walked on. Elara listened in silence, collecting the stories as if they were pieces of a puzzle she didn't know how to assemble. Her fear of him was real, a physical thing that chilled her hands and shortened her breath. But beneath the fear, something else began to sprout, a dangerous curiosity, the same that made her approach the dying rosebush in the garden. It was the desire to understand what lay beneath the surface of the darkness, to touch the terrible beauty that dwelt there. On a rainy afternoon, as the sky wept a grey light over the world, Lady Beatrice humiliated her in front of guests. A tea tray, a foot extended with calculation, and the porcelain shattered on the floor, staining the Persian rug with a liquid as dark as blood. The laughter was like shards of glass in her ears. "Clumsy!" Beatrice hissed, the word a poison. Elara felt her face burn, tears trapped in her throat like thorns. She knelt to pick up the pieces, her fingers trembling, shame a heavy cloak on her shoulders. And then silence fell. Valerius was at the door. His presence cut through the air like a blade. No one was laughing anymore. He didn't look at his sister, nor at the guests. His gaze met Elara's, kneeling on the floor, a bird with broken wings. There was no pity in his eyes, no anger. There was something deeper, something that resembled a dark recognition. He turned and left without a word, but his departure left a vacuum that was more eloquent than any speech. That night, the rain turned into a violent storm. The wind lashed the windows, and thunder shook the foundations of the house. Elara, unable to sleep, went down to the library. It was her forbidden place and, for that very reason, the most desired. The book-lined walls seemed a refuge against the fury of the world outside and inside. The smell of leather and paper was a comfort. She slid her fingers over the worn spines, feeling the weight of the stories that slept there. Her hand stopped on a dark-covered volume with no title. Curiosity overcame her. She took it, sat in a dark corner, and in the light of the lightning that tore through the sky, she began to read. They were poems, verses that spoke of eternal nights, of lost loves, and of a loneliness as vast as the universe itself. The words resonated with the melody of her own soul. She didn't hear the door open. She only felt once again the change in the atmosphere, the air becoming denser, colder. She raised her face, her heart leaping. Valerius was standing a few steps away, watching her. Fear paralyzed her. She would be punished, expelled. The book fell from her hands, the sound muffled by the carpet. She shrank back, awaiting the verdict, but he didn't move. His gaze only swept over the open book on the floor and then returned to her face. A flash of lightning lit the room, and for a fleeting moment, Elara saw something in his eyes, a shadow of pain, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. The moment stretched, suspended between one clap of thunder and the next. Then, as silently as he had arrived, he turned and left, leaving her alone with Arl, the echo of his presence and the poems that seemed to have been written with the blood of his own heart. The next morning, the book was no longer on the floor. It was on the small table beside her bed, in the room under the roof. The presence of the book in her room was a riddle Elara couldn't solve. Was it a gift or a warning? An approach or a way of marking his territory, of reminding her that no corner of this house, not even the most intimate of her thoughts, was safe from his surveillance? Fear and fascination waged a silent battle within her. She touched the dark leather cover with her fingertips, feeling the worn texture, imagining the hands that had held it before. The words of the poems came back to her in waves, fragments of a melancholy that now seemed to have a face, a pair of eyes as dark as the night. The mansion, which before had been just a labyrinth of oppression, began to take on a new dimension. It had become a chessboard where she was a solitary pawn, and he, the king who moved in shadows, controlling the game with an incomprehensible logic. Lady Beatrice and her swarm of wasps continued their hostilities, but their stingers seemed to have lost some of their venom. Elara's attention was elsewhere, tuned to a more subtle frequency, the sound of Valerius's footsteps in the corridor, the way the fire in the hearth seemed to crackle louder when he entered the room, the shadow his figure cast on the wall, long and imposing. She began to notice the details that others ignored, the way he would sometimes pause before an old portrait of a woman with sad eyes, an almost imperceptible shift in his posture that betrayed an ancient sorrow, or the way his long, pale fingers would drum on the arm of his chair when a specific melody was played on the piano, a melody that spoke of loss and regret. He was a ruined castle imposing on the outside but haunted within, and Elara, with her outsider's sensitivity, was the only one who seemed able to hear the ghosts. Winter arrived, covering the world in a white shroud. The snow muffled all sounds, making the silence of the mansion even deeper, more introspective. The winter garden was now a cathedral of ice, the branches of the plants drawing delicate arabesques on the frosted glass. Elara continued to care for her sanctuary, protecting the rosebush with cloths so the frost would not kill it completely. One afternoon, under a white sky and cold light, as she wrapped the fragile stems, she heard the iron door creak. Her heart leaped. Valerius entered the garden. This time he didn't stay outside, watching. He walked among the wild plants, the sound of his boots on the damp earth the only noise. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the cold that emanated from his body. Elara stood motionless, her breath caught in her throat. He looked at her hands, at the cloths protecting the rosebush. "Why do you do this?" His voice was low, a murmur that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. It wasn't a question of accusation, but of genuine curiosity. Elara swallowed hard, searching for words that wouldn't come. Her body answered for her. She raised her hand and gently touched one of the thorns of the rosebush. "Because there is still life here," she whispered. Her voice little more than a breath. It was the first time they had spoken directly to each other. The air between them vibrated with the weight of that moment. Valerius didn't reply. His gaze dropped from her hands to her face, and for an instant the mask of coldness seemed to crack. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, the stubbornness of one who protects life in the midst of desolation. He saw a reflection of himself, perhaps, of the spark he thought had been extinguished long ago. He turned and walked toward a dark corner of the garden, where a small stone statue of an angel covered in moss wept tears of frozen rain. He ran his fingers over the statue's stone face, a gesture of painful intimacy. Elara watched him, feeling she was witnessing something sacred and forbidden. She understood, in that moment, that his loneliness was an ocean, and he was drowning. From that day on, a silent routine was established. He would appear in the garden not every day but often. They never spoke. He would sit on a stone bench watching her work. She, in turn, would pretend not to notice his presence, but her every movement was calculated, conscious of the gaze that followed her. It was a strange dance, a wordless dialogue. His presence no longer frightened her in the same way. The fear had transformed into a constant tension, a rope stretched taut between them that could snap at any moment. She felt her body react to him in new and disturbing ways. Her skin tingled when he came near. Her blood ran faster in her veins. It was like being near a contained storm, feeling the electricity in the air before the lightning strike. Lady Beatrice, sensing this strange connection, intensified her cruelty. Her comments became more venomous, her traps more elaborate. She saw in Elara not just an insignificant maid, but a threat to her dominion over her brother, a mirror that reflected the darkness she herself tried to ignore. The climax of her malevolence came during the preparations for the Winter Ball, the most important social event of the year. Beatrice assigned Elara the impossible task of polishing all the family silver, a vast collection that would take days to clean, and she gave her a deadline, by dawn, on the day of the ball. It was a sentence. Elara worked without stopping, her hands plunged in cold water, her muscles aching. Exhaustion enveloped her like a fog, but stubbornness kept her from giving up. She would not give Beatrice the satisfaction of seeing her defeated. In the early hours of the ball day, with the pile of silver still half finished, exhaustion overcame her. She fell asleep at the kitchen table, her head resting on her arms, the metallic smell of silver clinging to her hair. She awoke to a soft touch on her shoulder. She opened her eyes, disoriented. Valerius was standing beside her, his face illuminated by the solitary light of a candle. Astonishment left her speechless. He looked at her hands, red and raw from the water and the effort. Without a word, he picked up a piece of silverware and a polishing cloth. He sat down across from her and began to work, in silence. Elara watched him, her heart beating so hard she feared he could hear it. The master of the mansion, the man feared by all, was there in the cold kitchen polishing silver by her side, sharing her punishment. There was no logic in that gesture. It was an act of pure, inexplicable solidarity. They worked together in the quiet of the early morning, the only sound the soft friction of cloth against metal. The candlelight danced on their faces, creating an intimate circle of complicity in the heart of the sleeping house. When the first ray of sunlight touched the window, all the silver shone, a river of light on the wooden table. Elara looked at him, her eyes full of a question she dared not ask. "No one needs to know," he said, his voice hoarse from the silence. He stood up, and for an instant, his hand hovered in the air, as if he wanted to touch her face. But he pulled back, the mask of coldness settling back onto his features. He left the kitchen as silently as he had entered, leaving Elara with her wounded hands, the gleaming silver, and the certainty that something irreversible had happened between them. The winter ball began that night. The mansion, usually sombre, was transformed. Chandeliers poured a golden light on the guests. The music of an orchestra floated in the air, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the halls. Elara, dressed in a simple maid's uniform, moved among the nobles like a ghost, serving wine and canapes, her body exhausted, but her mind on high alert. She looked for him, her gaze scanning the crowd. When she found him, he was surrounded by guests, the same imposing figure as always, but his eyes seemed distant, absent. He belonged at that party no more than she did. Lady Beatrice, radiant in a blue silk gown, noticed the exchange of glances between them, an invisible thread connecting them across the crowded room. A cruel smile curved her lips. The humiliation with the silver had not been enough. She needed something more. Something that would break Elara once and for all. She waited for the moment Elara was passing with a tray of champagne glasses. With a subtle, deliberate movement, Beatrice extended her foot. Elara tripped, the tray flying from her hands. The glasses shattered on the floor with a deafening crash. Champagne splashed onto a countess's dress, who let out a sharp cry. The music stopped. The entire hall turned to look. The silence that followed was terrible, heavy with judgment. Elara was at the centre of it all, paralysed by shame. Her face burned, tears threatening to overflow. "Incompetent!" Beatrice's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Apologise to the Countess. On your knees." The order was a whiplash. To kneel, there in front of everyone. It was the total annihilation of her dignity. Elara felt her legs weaken. The world seemed to spin, the lights of the chandeliers turning into blurs. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, piercing her. She closed her own, preparing for the fall. But the fall never came. A shadow fell over her. The air around her grew colder, the pressure of the silence intensified. Elara opened her eyes. Valerius was standing in front of her, a shield between her and the rest of the world. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on his sister, and for the first time, Elara saw a glacial fury in his eyes, a contained storm that made Beatrice take a step back, the smile frozen on her face. Then, he did something no one could have predicted. Slowly, he knelt. There in the middle of the ballroom, the master of those lands, the feared Lord Alcester, knelt beside the humiliated maid. He picked up one of the broken shards of glass from the floor, his gesture calm and deliberate. The shock in the hall was palpable, a wave of astonishment that left everyone breathless. He said nothing. He didn't need to. That act, that voluntary descent to her level, was a declaration more powerful than any shout. It was a choice. He was choosing her side. Publicly, irrevocably. He raised his face to her, and in the deafening silence, his gaze said everything. "I see you." Valerius's gesture reverberated through the hall like a shockwave, shattering the established order with the silent force of an earthquake. Time seemed to suspend itself, each second stretched to its limit. Lady Beatrice, pale as wax, stared at her kneeling brother with a mixture of disbelief and horror. Her power, built on the foundations of hierarchy and fear, was crumbling before her eyes. Valerius, still on his knees, didn't care about the hundreds of eyes dissecting him. His attention was entirely on Elara. He held out his hand not to help her up, but as an invitation for her to acknowledge him in this abyss he had created for them. Elara, for her part, felt the world tilt on its axis. The shame that had suffocated her moments before was replaced by an astonishment so profound it left her breathless. This man, who was the personification of power and distance, had humbled himself for her. He had worn her humiliation like a cloak. The act didn't save her. He joined her in her fall. Their eyes met, and in the space between them, the noise of the world disappeared. There was only her ragged breath and his stillness, which was a force of nature. Slowly, like one waking from a long dream, Elara knelt completely, not in obedience to Beatrice's command, but in response to his gesture. She joined him on the floor, among the shards of glass, and began to gather them, her fingers moving in sync with his. They were two solitudes meeting at the lowest point, on the cold floor of others' contempt. The hall remained in a sepulchral silence. No one dared to move or speak. What they were witnessing was not just a social scandal. It was a ritual, a public confession that rewrote all the rules. Valerius, the lord of the castle, had declared his allegiance not with his own kind, but with the outcast. After they had collected the last shard, he stood up. The movement was fluid, unhurried, recovering his height and his natural authority. He then extended his hand to Elara. This time, it was a silent command. She hesitated for a heartbeat, the contact of his skin on hers a promise of fire and ice. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed over hers, the grip firm, unquestionable. The warmth of his hand, in contrast to the coldness that always enveloped him, was a shock that ran through her entire body. He helped her up, keeping her by his side. Then, with Elara's hand still in his, he turned to the crowd. His face was an impenetrable mask, but his eyes swept over the guests with a glacial warning. "The party is over." His voice, though calm, held the weight of a final judgment. No one argued. The guests began to disperse in a confused murmur, avoiding looking directly at the unlikely couple in the centre of the hall. It was a retreat, a stampede of sheep before the unquestionable presence of the wolf. Lady Beatrice remained, her face a mask of restrained fury. "Have you lost your mind?" she hissed, her voice trembling. Valerius turned to her, his gaze even colder. "On the contrary," he replied. "I believe I have just found it." He said no more. With Elara's hand still in his, he led her out of the ballroom, passing his sister as if she were a ghost. He guided her through the silent corridors, up the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing in the void left by the party. Elara followed him, her heart a wild bird beating against her ribs. His hand in hers was an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Where was he taking her? What would happen now? He didn't stop in front of his own apartments, nor did he take her back to her room under the roof. He continued upward, to a wing of the mansion she had never seen, a wing that everyone said had been closed for years. He stopped before a massive oak door and opened it. The air that came from within was thin, heavy with the scent of dust and time. He led her inside. It was a room, or rather the remains of one. Furniture covered in white sheets looked like spectres in the gloom. The only source of light was the full moon streaming through a huge balcony window, painting the floor with a silvery glow. Valerius finally released her hand. The residual warmth on her skin was a brand. He walked to the window and opened the glass doors. The cold night air invaded the room, bringing with it the distant sound of the wind in the trees. He stood with his back to her, watching the snow-covered landscape. Silence settled between them again, but it was a different silence. It was no longer the quiet of oppression or tension, but a silence of expectation, of revelation. "This room belonged to my mother," he said, his voice an echo in the void. Elara shivered. Valerius's mother was a legend in the house, a figure shrouded in mystery. They said she was an outsider, of mixed blood, a woman who never fit in with the nobility and who died young. Of sorrow. Her story was a mirror of Elara's. She also found refuge in the garden, he continued, his voice losing some of its harshness, becoming almost nostalgic. She believed that even the most broken things deserved a chance to bloom. He turned to her. The moonlight sculpted his face, accentuating the shadows under his eyes. "When I saw you there, tending to that rosebush, I saw her." The confession was simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of loneliness. He didn't just see Elara, he saw an echo of his mother, a ghost of a kindness he thought he had lost forever. Elara took a step forward, drawn by that unexpected vulnerability. Why did you do that?" "In the hall?" she asked, her voice faint. He moved closer to her, closing the distance between them until only a few inches separated them. The air became electric. He raised his hand, and this time he didn't hesitate. His fingers, cold as the night, touched her face, the gesture incredibly gentle. "Because I could no longer watch. Because their silence was more violent than any scream," he said. And in his voice there was an ancient anger, a pain that came from long before she arrived. "And because in your silence I heard the only true voice in this house." His touch was like a seal, a brand that redefined her. She was no longer the orphan, the maid. She was the woman the most powerful man she knew had defended. The woman for whom he had knelt. Vertigo hit her. The floor seemed to have disappeared from under her feet. She was floating in an unknown space between fear and an overwhelming desire. Her eyes locked on his, and she saw the same abyss that used to frighten her. But now she no longer wanted to run. She wanted to jump. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. His breath was warm on her cold skin. The world was reduced to that moment, to that tiny space between their lips. His scent, a mixture of night, winter, and a unique masculine fragrance, intoxicated her. It was a moment of choice, of surrender. Her body yearned for that contact, for that fusion. But her mind, the survival instinct that had kept her whole for so long, screamed in alarm. To give herself to him would be to lose the only thing that still belonged to her, herself. With a monumental effort, she took a step back, breaking the spell. The air returned to her lungs in a painful gasp. I can't, she whispered, the words tearing at her throat. The disappointment on his face was a fleeting shadow, quickly replaced by a dark understanding. He didn't insist. He just nodded, an almost imperceptible movement of his head. "I know," he said, and in those two words there was a universe of resignation. He had offered her a glimpse of his world, of his soul, and she had retreated. The distance between them returned, but now it was a conscious distance, a choice made by both of them. He had led her to the edge of the abyss, but he would not force her to jump. Elara's refusal hung in the cold air of the room, an invisible yet insurmountable barrier. Valerius didn't move, but something in his posture shifted. The vulnerability he had briefly exposed was drawn back inside, locked away beneath the layers of coldness and control that were so familiar to him. He was the fortress once more, impenetrable. Elara felt a sharp pang of regret, a pain that was almost physical. She had rejected not an advance, but a confession, the offering of a soul that rarely showed itself. Fear, her old companion, had conquered desire. She lowered her gaze, unable to face the dark understanding in his eyes. The silence that settled was heavy, laden with unspoken words, with the kiss that did not happen. He moved away, returning to the window, and the distance between them seemed to multiply, becoming an abyss once more. "You no longer need to serve," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, as he looked out into the night. "This room is yours if you want it. No one will bother you here." The offer was generous, a promotion from maid to protégée. It was security, comfort. But to Elara, it sounded like a gilded cage. He was elevating her, but he was also isolating her, placing her on a pedestal where she would be safe but alone, trapped in his orbit to be watched and guarded, but perhaps no longer touched. "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured, the phrase an echo of her former identity. He turned to her, a bitter, fleeting smile on his lips. "You are already far more than that, Elara." The use of her name, so rare on his lips, struck her with force. He didn't see her as a burden, but as, what, a disturbance? A redemption? A responsibility? He left her alone in that room full of ghosts. The door closed with a soft click, but the sound echoed in the vastness of the silence. Elara walked through the room, touching the covered furniture, feeling the history ingrained in the dust. This place was both a sanctuary and a prison. Her life had changed irrevocably, but she didn't know if it was for the better. She had exchanged Beatrice's open hostility for Valerius's silent possessiveness. The following days were strange and disorienting. Elara remained in the West Wing as he had instructed. The other maids avoided her, looking at her with a mixture of fear and envy. She was no longer one of them, but she didn't belong to the world of the masters either. She floated in a social limbo, an anomaly. Lady Beatrice had retreated to her chambers, a defeated queen in her own castle. Her absence was a loud presence, a silence that screamed resentment. The mansion seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what the next move would be in the silent game between its master and the orphan he had elevated. Valerius left her in peace as he had promised. He didn't seek her out. Their paths rarely crossed. But Elara felt his presence constantly. She knew when he was in the house, felt the weight of his gaze even when she couldn't see him. He was watching her from a distance, giving her space but keeping her firmly within his field of vision. The freedom he had given her was an illusion. She could wander the house, the garden, but the property walls were the limits of her world. And everywhere she felt his eyes on her. The loneliness, which was once a condition of her existence, was now a poisoned gift. She had time, she had peace, but she had no one to belong to. The lack of him, the absence of his intense and disturbing presence, was an emptiness that hurt more than the previous oppression. She missed the tension, the electricity in the air, the danger and the promise he represented. One night, as the snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, Elara could no longer bear the stillness of her new room. The longing for something she never had spurred her on. She went down the stairs through the dark corridors and headed to the one place that still felt like hers, the library. She expected to find it empty, a silent refuge. But he was there, sitting in an armchair near the fireplace, a book open on his lap, though he wasn't reading. He was staring into the fire, his face illuminated by the dancing flames, lost in thought. The sight of him so unexpected made Elara's heart stop. He raised his head slowly, as if sensing her presence. His eyes met hers across the room. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a weary acceptance, as if he had been waiting for her. She remained at the door, hesitant. Part of her wanted to flee, to return to the safety of her solitude. But another stronger part pushed her forward. She walked slowly toward him, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the carpet. She stopped at a respectful distance from the fireplace. "I can't sleep," she said, the confession a whisper. "Neither can I," he replied, his voice hoarse. He closed the book and set it aside. "Sit." He pointed to the armchair opposite his. Hesitantly, she obeyed. She sat on the edge, her body tense. The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. It was a less charged silence than before, almost comfortable. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on the flames. The question caught her by surprise. "Regret what?" "Coming to the mansion. Refusing his kiss, existing?" "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Sometimes freedom is more frightening than a prison." "Freedom is never given. It is taken," he said. And there was a weight of experience in his words. And it always has a price. They sat in silence for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts, but sharing the warmth of the fire. Elara began to relax, the heat softening the tension in her muscles. In his presence, at that moment, she didn't feel like a protégée or a project. She felt like an equal, another sleepless soul seeking solace in the night. "Why do you never leave here?" she asked, her curiosity overcoming her caution. "This castle," he sighed, a deep, tired sound. "Because this place is me. My roots are sunk into this stone, this land. To leave would be like tearing myself from myself." He looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze held her captive. "And because there are things in the outside world from which this place protects me." "And protects others from you?" she dared to ask, the sentence escaping before she could stop it. A flash of something that looked like pain crossed his eyes. He didn't answer immediately. He just watched her, as if weighing the gravity of her question and the weight of the truth. "Yes," he finally said. "That too." The confession hit her with the force of a punch. There was a darkness in him, a darkness he kept contained within the walls of that castle, a darkness from which he was trying to protect her, and yet she was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. At that moment, by the fire, Elara made a decision. She could no longer live in limbo, in the sterile safety he had offered her. If she was to live in this castle, it would be on her own terms. "I don't want the room in the West Wing anymore," she said, her voice firm. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. "I want my old room back, and I want to work in the garden, in the library, wherever is needed." She was abdicating her status as a protégée, voluntarily choosing to become a servant again. But it was her choice, a way of taking back control. Valerius studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. She expected him to refuse, to be angry, but instead a slow smile formed on his lips. It wasn't the bitter smile from before, but something genuine, something that reached his eyes, making them sparkle with an unexpected light. "As you wish," he said, and there was admiration in his voice. "But know that to me nothing changes. You will never again be just a maid in this house." He stood up, walked over to her, and leaning down, placed a soft kiss on her forehead. The contact was brief, chaste, but it burned her skin like an ember. It was a blessing, a pact sealed. "Now go to sleep, Elara," he whispered. "Tomorrow will be a long day." She stood up, her body trembling from the reverberation of that touch. She left the library and returned to her small room under the roof, feeling that, for the first time since she had arrived, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had found her place, not in a social status, but in the complex web of her relationship with this enigmatic man. She was not his prisoner, nor his protégée. She was his challenge. And that was a much truer form of freedom. Elara's decision to resume her old duties, but now by her own choice, subtly altered the dynamics of the mansion. It wasn't a return to the previous state, but the creation of a new equilibrium, fragile and unspoken. She was no longer the invisible victim. She was a conscious presence, a piece moving on the board with a newfound intention. Lady Beatrice, seeing her once again in servant's clothes, interpreted the act as a defeat, a capitulation. A triumphant smile returned to her lips, but there was an uncertainty in her eyes. Elara didn't look defeated. There was a new serenity in her posture, a quiet strength that made her more impenetrable than before. Beatrice's attempts at humiliation now seemed childish, pathetic. Her sarcastic comment was met with a calm silence that disarmed it. A harsh order was carried out with a quiet efficiency that emptied it of its power. Elara had learned from Valerius to use silence as both a weapon and a shield. Her true focus, however, was not on Beatrice, but on the garden and the library, the two domains she now considered her own. The winter garden under her care began to flourish in a way no one had seen for years. The ancient rosebush, which everyone had given up for dead, sprouted with a stubborn vigour, producing small green leaves that were a promise of colour in the midst of the winter grey. Ilara spent hours there, her hands in the earth feeling the pulse of life returning. It was work that grounded her, that connected her to something real and tangible amid the web of emotions and tensions in the house. Valerius continued to watch her, but in a different way. The distance he kept was less that of a guard and more that of a fascinated spectator. Sometimes he would appear in the garden, no longer sitting on the stone bench, but walking among the plants, occasionally asking a question about one species or another. The conversations were brief, factual, but beneath the surface they were a continuation of the dialogue they had begun. They were two solitudes learning to orbit each other without colliding. In the library, their connection deepened in another way. He began to leave books for her, no longer in secret, but openly, on the table where she worked. They were books on botany, local history, poetry. Each book was a message, an invitation to step a little further into his world. One night, she found him in the library reading an old map of the valley. He called her over and with his finger traced the borders of his lands. All of this, he said, his voice low, is held in balance by ancient rules, pacts made long before I was born. He looked at her, his gaze intense. You, with your compassion for broken things, have disturbed that balance. The accusation wasn't harsh, but matter of fact, she was the stone dropped in the lake, and the ripples were still spreading. Was the balance fair? She asked, her voice firm. He stared at her for a long moment. Justice is a human concept, he replied enigmatically. Nature seeks only survival. Spring arrived slowly, like a whispered secret. The snow melted, revealing the dark, damp earth. The air lost its icy bite, becoming softer, laden with the scent of new life. And with the spring, the rosebush in the winter garden bloomed. They were not large or exuberant roses, but small blossoms of a red, so deep they seemed to hold the colour of a drop of blood. They were flowers of a painful, stubborn beauty. One afternoon, as Ilara admired the first open rose, Valerius entered the garden. He walked to the rosebush and touched one of the petals with his fingertip, a surprisingly delicate gesture. My mother would have loved this, he said, his voice little more than a murmur. He turned to Ilara, and in his eyes was an emotion she had never seen before. A raw, unguarded gratitude. That moment of shared vulnerability was more intimate than any kiss could have been. He moved closer to her, and this time there was no hesitation. He took her face in his hands, his palms warm against her skin. You brought spring back to this place, Ilara, he whispered. And then he kissed her. The kiss was not tender or chaste. It was a kiss of hunger, of years of contained loneliness, of a dark and overwhelming desire. It was the collision of two worlds, the meeting of light and darkness. Ilara did not pull back. She responded with the same intensity, her body recognizing his, her soul recognizing his. Fear dissolved, replaced by a visceral certainty that this was inevitable, the destiny she had been walking toward since the day she arrived. Her hands went up to his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. The kiss deepened, a dance of power and surrender, of pain and ecstasy. It was the breaking of all barriers, the annihilation of silence. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. His forehead rested against hers, his eyes closed. I didn't know I was still capable of feeling this, he said, his voice hoarse, broken. What do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling. He opened his eyes, and the abyss in them now held a gleam of fierce possessiveness. Now, he said, you are mine. The declaration was not a proposal, but a fact. It was the claiming of one soul by another, and Ilara, instead of feeling trapped, felt a strange sense of belonging. She had found her place not in the mansion, but in him. However, the outside world would not disappear. Their happiness was a fragile bubble of light in a castle of shadows. Lady Beatrice, seeing the undeniable change in their relationship, felt her hatred turn to panic. Ilara was no longer a threat to her status. She was a threat to her very existence in the house. If Valerius married the orphan, Beatrice's place in the mansion would be finished. She needed to act, and act decisively. Her plan was diabolical in its simplicity. She knew the family secrets, the ancient pacts Valerius had mentioned. She knew of the darkness he kept contained, and she knew that his greatest weakness now was Ilara. Beatrice began to spread rumors throughout the neighborhood, poisonous whispers that painted Ilara not as a Cinderella, but as a witch, a sorceress who had enchanted the Lord with dark magic to steal his fortune and his title. She used Ilara's social vulnerability, her outsider status, against her. The seeds of suspicion fell on fertile ground. The people of the valley, who already feared their lord, easily believed that a malevolent force had taken him over. The atmosphere in the village turned hostile. When Ilara went to the village for supplies, people would move away, making protective signs. The children who once smiled at her now ran to hide. She was becoming an outcast again, but this time on a much larger scale. Ilara tried to ignore it, protected by the cocoon of her relationship with Valerius, but the poison began to seep in. Valerius grew darker, more protective. He forbade her from going to the village alone. The shadows under his eyes deepened. The balance he fought to maintain was unraveling. The climax of Beatrice's plan came during a visit from a distant relative, a church inquisitor known for his rigidity and his zeal in hunting heresies. Beatrice invited him, planting in his mind the seed of suspicion about the evil influence that had taken hold in the Alcester mansion. The inquisitor, a man with cold, fanatical eyes, arrived with a small retinue. His presence in the mansion was like a storm cloud. He watched Ilara with a calculating gaze, seeing in her silent beauty and her humble origins a confirmation of his suspicions. Beatrice set the stage for the final confrontation. During a tense dinner, she accused Ilara openly. "This woman is a witch," she declared, her voice ringing in the dining hall. "She has bewitched my brother. She has brought evil to this house. Look at the garden blooming out of season. It is the devil's work." The inquisitor rose, his face a mask of righteous certainty. "In the name of God, this woman will be tried." Valerius leaped to his feet, the fury on his face so terrible that even the inquisitor took a step back. "No one will touch her," he growled, his voice a restrained thunder. "She is under my protection." "Your protection means nothing against the law of God," the inquisitor retorted. "If she is innocent, she has nothing to fear. She will be submitted to a trial. If she survives, God will have judged her innocent." The trial was a known death sentence, to be bound and thrown into the lake. If she sank and died, she was innocent. If she floated, she was a witch and would be burned. Valerius was cornered. To defy the inquisitor openly would mean war with the church, something that would put all his people in danger. But to hand over Ilara was unthinkable. Ilara looked at Valerius's anguished face, at the evil triumph on Beatrice's, and at the fanatical coldness of the inquisitor. She understood that she was the pawn in a much larger game. And she understood that, to save him, she might need to sacrifice herself. With a calmness that surprised everyone, including herself, she stood up. "I accept the trial." Ilara's declaration fell into the hall like a stone in a deep well, its impact echoing in the stunned silence that followed. Valerius turned to her, his face a mask of disbelief and panic. "Ilara, no," he said, his voice a desperate plea, his lordly composure forgotten. He took a step toward her, but she raised a hand, a subtle gesture that stopped him. In her gaze, he saw not fear, but an unshakable resolve. She wasn't surrendering. She was taking control in the only way she could. Beatrice smiled, a victorious and cruel smile. The inquisitor nodded gravely, satisfied with the accused's apparent submission to the divine will. The date of the trial was set for the next day, at noon on the shores of the Black Lake that bordered the Alcaster property. The news spread like wildfire, and the anticipation in the region was a sick mixture of fear and excitement. That night, the mansion was quieter than ever, a silence that precedes a storm. Valerius, frantic, tried to find a way out. He paced the library, his mind racing through plans of escape, of confrontation. He could kill the Inquisitor and his retinue, but that would bring an army to his door. He could flee with Ilara, but they would be hunted like animals for the rest of their lives. Ilara found him there, standing before the unlit fireplace, defeat weighing on his shoulders. He seemed smaller, more human than she had ever seen him. She approached and, for the first time, she initiated contact, placing her hand on his arm. The muscle beneath her palm was as taut as a steel cord. "Look at me, Valerius," she said, her voice calm and firm. He raised his face, and the agony in his eyes was a knife in her heart. "I will not let them do this," he said, his voice hoarse. "Trust me," she whispered, and in her tone was a certainty he couldn't comprehend. "I trust you more than my own life," he answered. "That is why this is unbearable." "Remember what you said," she continued. "Nature seeks survival. There are pacts older than the laws of men." He stared at her, a spark of understanding beginning to dawn in his despair. He was thinking like a man, limited by human rules. She, with her intuitive connection to the forces of life, saw other possibilities. What was she planning? He didn't know, but her calm was a balm to his tormented soul. That night, they did not sleep. They remained together in the library, not speaking much, just sharing each other's presence. It was both a farewell and a promise. The touch of their hands, the warmth of their bodies close together was the only truth in a world gone mad. The next morning, the sky was an oppressive grey. A crowd from the village and neighbouring lands gathered on the shores of the lake, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and superstitious fear. The Inquisitor was there, in his ceremonial robes beside Beatrice, who could barely contain her excitement. Ilara was brought out, her hands tied behind her back. She was pale, but her face was serene. Her gaze was not on the crowd or her accusers, but fixed on Valerius, who stood near the water, his figure a statue of contained fury. Their eyes met across the distance, and they communicated in their silent language. "Trust me." The Inquisitor recited the accusations and the rules of the trial. 2 guards seized Ilara and led her to the edge of a small wooden pier that jutted out over the dark, still waters of the lake. The water was deep there and so cold that the shock alone could kill. They tied a stone to her feet, a weight to ensure she would sink quickly. The crowd's silence was total. The only sound was the rustling of the wind in the trees. Ilara looked one last time at Valerius. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod, the signal they had agreed upon. He trusted her. With a push, the guards threw her into the water. The sound of her body hitting the surface was a dull thud, followed by a violent bubbling as she sank. The crowd held its breath. Beatrice smiled. Valerius closed his eyes for an instant, his body rigid. The seconds dragged on, as long as an eternity. The surface of the lake became smooth again, motionless. A murmur went through the crowd. She had sunk. She was innocent, but she was dead. The Inquisitor began to recite a prayer for the soul of the sacrificed innocent. Beatrice for a moment looked disappointed. Ilara's death freed her of her rival, but the proof of her innocence tainted her victory. And then, something happened. The water in the centre of the lake began to churn. It wasn't the bubbling from before, but a slow whirlpool, as if something was awakening in the depths. The crowd fell back, frightened. The Inquisitor stopped his prayer, looking at the water with suspicion. Valerius opened his eyes, his face alert, expectant. From the centre of the whirlpool, something emerged. First a head, then shoulders. It was Ilara. But she wasn't struggling, wasn't gasping for air. She floated serenely on the surface, her eyes closed, her hair spreading around her like a dark halo. The ropes that bound her hands were undone, and the stone at her feet was gone. A cry of horror and amazement erupted from the crowd. "Witch!" someone screamed, and the cry was echoed by dozens of voices. "She floats." "She is a witch!" Beatrice was triumphant. "I told you. There is the proof." The Inquisitor, his face pale but his eyes burning with fanatical fire, pointed at Ilara. "Seize her! Take her to the pyre!" But no one moved. A primal fear, deeper than religious fanaticism, paralyzed them all. The scene was unnatural, terrifying, and then Valerius moved. He didn't run, didn't shout. He simply walked into the water. He entered the lake without hesitation, the cold water soaking his clothes, until he was waist deep. He walked toward Ilara, who was still floating, motionless. The crowd watched, mesmerized. He reached her and took her in his arms. The moment he touched her, she opened her eyes. Her eyes were no longer those of a frightened human. They held an ancient depth, the dark wisdom of the lake's waters. She looked at Valerius, and a faint smile touched her lips. Valerius carried her out of the water, his drenched suit clinging to his body, and walked with her in his arms through the paralyzed crowd. The people moved away, clearing a path, fear and reverence mixed on their faces. He stopped in front of Beatrice and the Inquisitor. The fury on his face had been replaced by a terrifying calm. "This trial is over," he said, his voice low but carrying a power that made the air vibrate. "You sought a monster, and now you have found one." He was not referring to Elara. He was referring to himself. He looked at his sister, and in his gaze, Beatrice saw the end of her world. "Leave my house, leave my lands, and never return," he commanded, each word a drop of ice. Then he turned to the Inquisitor. "Take your false justice and your petty gods far from here. This valley has older laws, and from this day forward, they will be enforced." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and began to walk back to the mansion, carrying Elara in his arms as if she weighed nothing. The crowd watched him go in absolute silence. They saw their lord, no longer just a man but a force of nature, reclaiming what was his. What happened in that lake, no one could ever explain. Some said it was a miracle, others, dark magic. But the truth was older. Elara, with her connection to life, had awakened something in the lake, a dormant force that recognized her as an equal and protected her. She had not simply survived. She had been reborn, transformed. That night at the Alcester mansion, the lights in every room were lit, a beacon of defiance against the darkness of the world. Elara and Valerius were together, no longer as master and servant, protector and protected, but as two halves of the same ancient soul, united by a pact sealed in fire and water. The balance of the valley had indeed been broken, but in its place, a new power had risen, the power of a love that was as terrifying as it was beautiful, and as eternal as the land itself. The aftermath of the trial at the lake was a silence that spread throughout the valley. Lady Beatrice left at dawn without a farewell, a dark figure in a carriage that took her to a self-imposed exile. The Inquisitor and his retinue retreated hastily, spreading stories of witchcraft and demons, but their words lacked power there. The people of the valley who had witnessed the impossible now looked at the Alcester mansion, not with fear, but with a fearful reverence. They didn't understand what had happened, but they knew they had touched forces beyond their comprehension. In the mansion, a new quiet settled. It was not the quiet of oppression or tension, but a deep peace, like that which follows a great storm. Elara and Valerius lived in a world of their own, isolated not by walls, but by the extraordinary nature of their bond. Elara's transformation in the lake was not just an event, but an awakening. Something inside her had permanently changed. She carried in her eyes the depth of the dark waters, an ancestral wisdom that made her at once more serene and more powerful. Her connection with nature deepened. The winter garden bloomed under her touch in an almost supernatural way, the plants growing with an exuberant vitality. The animals of the forest did not fear her, and sometimes birds would land on her shoulder as if she were an ancient tree. Valerius watched her with a mixture of fascination and adoration. The woman he had fallen in love with was still there, but now she was more. She was the personification of the wild, untamable spirit he had always felt pulsing beneath the land of his estate. She was the soul of the valley. Their love was a silent, overwhelming force. It was not a love of sweet words or conventional romantic gestures. It was a love of shared presences, of glances that contained universes, of touches that were both an anchor and a liberation. They would spend hours in the library reading together in silence, or walking through the forest, communicating without the need for words. Their relationship was not without its darkness. Valerius's possessive and somber nature was still there, but it was now tempered by Elara's quiet strength. Her darkness, the ancient wisdom that had awakened, balanced his. They did not try to change each other. They accepted each other in their entirety, light and shadow. One night, They were on the balcony of his mother's old room, watching the full moon bathe the landscape in its silver light. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked, his voice a whisper in the quiet of the night. She turned to him, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "I was never afraid of you, Valerius. I was afraid of the power you had over me. And now?" he insisted. "Now," she said, touching his face with her fingertips, "I understand that your power and mine come from the same source. There is nothing left to fear." He pulled her close, her body molding to his. "I love you, Ilara," he said, and the words, so rarely used by him, seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "I know," she replied, and in her voice there was no submission, but a deep recognition, as the river loves the sea and the night loves the moon. They did not marry in a human ceremony. Their commitment was deeper, a pact sealed with the ancient forces of the earth. To the outside world, she was Lady Alcester, the enigmatic woman who had tamed the Dark Lord. But to them, they were just Valerius and Ilara, two souls who had found their home in each other. The years passed, but they did not seem to age. Time at the Alcester mansion seemed to follow a different rhythm. Their story became a legend in the valley, whispered around fireplaces on winter nights. A story about an orphan who became a queen, about a lord who found his heart, about a love that was as eternal and mysterious as nature itself. The end of their story was not a happily ever after, for happiness is too simple a concept for the complexity of their souls. It was something deeper, a balance between light and darkness, power and submission, loneliness and belonging. They had created their own universe within the walls of the mansion, a sanctuary governed not by the laws of men, but by the laws of the heart and the land. And there, in that refuge, they found not happiness but peace. A deep and lasting peace like the quiet of an ancient forest after the rain. A peace that was, in itself, the truest form of love. If this story has found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes what hurts us is what makes us most human.